View 3 yet? Okay. That also helps me figure it out. In case you didn't know, I'm Shawn Wildermuth. I'm an instructor and coach, yada, yada, yada. So let's talk about View 3. How many have never used View at all? Or about half of you, okay. We're going to be building something from the ground up, but at least to give you a taste. Someone's a lot more popular than I am. Thank you. I don't want to be reminded of how unpopular I am. So we're going to focus on what's new in View 3, but that'll sort of imply some of why View, I think, is an important framework, and we'll build something at the end to sort of show you the workflow. So there's a bunch of new features, some of which we'll talk about, some of which we won't. Type support, script support is one of the larger features that they really got beaten up in View 2 about, and being able to use TypeScript optionally. It's not required like it is in Angular, but if you're a shop that wants to use TypeScript, it's now a first-class citizen. Global mounting has changed, and I'll show you what that looks like. The composition API, reactivity. The big change if you're using View 2 going to View 3 around filters that you'll want to be aware of. And again, I'll show you how that works. Suspense and teleport are two interesting features I'll show you that are pretty much stolen verbatim from React. So if you're familiar with those terms there. And then I'll show you Vite, which is a new way to sort of build Vue applications and web applications in general. And that isn't expressly about View 3, but it came out of the same people in the sort of the same time frame. And because I think it's a kind of a monumental shift in the way we're developing, I want to make sure you guys get a sense of that. Yeah. So that was the only slide. Did anyone want to take a picture of that slide I spent about 4 weeks writing? Okay. Let's dive into code where I'm way more comfortable anyway. So let me just head over to where I'm doing the talks. We're at ConnectTech. And View 3. Sorry about that. I thought I had that already queued up. So I'm going to start at the command line because that's usually how you start new projects, though we're going to spend most of our time in an IDE actually writing code. But there's really two sort of paths to a new Vue project, and the main one is the Vue CLI, which is just a tool for creating and running Vue projects. And when we go ahead and say Vue create, whoops, I'm going to use a flag called B that's going to get rid of some of the boilerplate, and I'll call this fun with ConnectTech. And it's going to churn a little. Make sure I have an internet connection, yeah. And I'm going to manually select features so we can kind of see what this experience is like. Now, this is the same for View 2 or View 3, but here we're going to pick the features it wants to sort of build in by default. So if we wanted to opt into TypeScript, which I will so I can show you how that works, I want to use the router or Vuex, which I'm not going to use right now. I'm just going to do kind of a plain version. It could implement unit testing or end-to-end testing for you as well. But I'm going to pick a pretty simple one. And here we can make a decision about 2 or 3. You can use TypeScript with 2. It's just not there. It's just not quite ready for it. So we're going to go with 3 since that's the talk I'm giving. You'll notice up here, if you can read that, that it's also saying, do you want to use the class syntax? And no is the default. It's because they're going through the process of deprecating class style components, sort of an idea that they borrowed from Angular, and there wasn't a lot of adoption, and it was sort of clunky. And I always say yes to Babel and TypeScript together. That's just more about how the compiler works. You don't need to worry about that. And I'm going to create the configuration file. Here it's going to go ahead and install all the pieces. And if you move your mouse clockwise, it speeds up this process. For some reason, it helps the electrons because we never know where electrons are. Any physics majors? Okay, good. If you hear a titter, you know someone took physics. Okay. So my only physics joke, so don't worry. So if we go into our fun with ConnectTech, and I'm just going to load that up in code. What we end up with is a project that should be pretty similar if you've used the CLI for 2. But we're going to start by sort of talking about the beginning. Now you'll notice that all the files are TypeScript now. But if you look at a file like this, even though it's a TypeScript file, there's no real type stuff here. So what are we getting out of TypeScript? What we're getting out of TypeScript is that if your IDE isn't normally supported, this is going to include a good notion of what the IntelliSense is, even if you're not actually explicitly using types. Because in Vue 3, everything has type libs now, and that makes it much easier to work with. The other thing that's different here is instead of creating a new instance of a Vue object like you would, you're going to use this method from Vue called createApp. And instead of there being, if you were importing some library, a very common thing you'd use is Vue use and then some extension or plugin to the library. This meant that those extensions were available to all instances of Vue, and instead of that, they went to this other method, which is that this chain is where you would do use, and let's say you're using Vutilate, you do it there instead. So it's just a different way to think about this all composing down to single, clean versions of the same sort of thing you're doing. Now, the difference of what this is doing versus what you might be used to in Vue 2 isn't a lot. Like this is, visibly it's different, but all the same moving pieces are there. If we were using a router, we'd add the router here. If we're using Vuex, we'd add Vuex here. Like it's all happening in sort of the same flow. It's just a little different. And the rest of it should be pretty simple. I've gone for no boilerplate, so we get a really simple Vue app with actually no components at all. But let's go ahead and create a new component so we can see what that looks like in Vue 3. Actually, I'm going to say views. It always feels weird, a view. I'm just going to call it my home view. And the template part of this is identical. One of the nice things about Vue 3 is that you don't need to always have a wrapper in the template. So in Vue 2, you always had to have one root element. And so something like this is perfectly valid now, and that we don't have to worry about that. And that also means that it's going to be less concerned with how deeply nested things are, because you're not artificially putting yet another wrapper around it. And we'll come back to that. And here I'll say script. And I'm going to specify TS as my language, because I'm going to be using TypeScript here. Doesn't mean you have to use TypeScript in every case either. You could say JS here, and it'll interpret it as JavaScript instead of TypeScript.
Is that just a compiler hint?
Yes. Yeah. So it knows which of the compiler pieces to use in the Vue. If this weren't a single file component, you wouldn't need that. It would just be a .ts file instead. So it's effectively the same as what the extension does for a regular file. And the new way using component API, even though I know a lot of you have seen this already, is we're going to export a default instance. And instead of just creating an object here, we're going to call define component. And this is going to take that same object that could be composition API or the options API, but it has this little bit of wrapper that we need to bring in from Vue. And this is one of the things that I had to get used to, and that is that this new method of creating things in Vue 3 means it's having to be more explicit about not using anything in global scope, right? Anything I'm going to use, I need to import. And that also means that there's less sort of, I wonder what's in the global scope, right? And so you're going to see some sort of repeats of that. If I was using components just like I would in 2, I would just say components and include them here. I can also even give this component a name. Not required, but I'll call it my home view. And let's go ahead and just say, whoops, right? We make a really complicated component so far. Is everyone with me on the complexity? And so in order to use it in here, there's a sort of a couple ways to think about this. In View 2, it was very common to define all your components as globally, and you can still do that. You can use that defined component and give it a name, and then it'd be available globally. But more typically, to really, again, with this idea of you know everything you're using, is you're going to go ahead and import home view from views, home view, right? And then the export default, create, define. Component for this one, we can just say components. Now, if your organization has a lot of reusable components, you're going to want to do them globally and not have to do this every time. But you have both options, and it's a little bit more obvious in this case how to do that. And then we'll just say home view. And then, of course, we can just replace this whole thing. Assuming we were going to do something else. Come on, where's my scroll lock key that I hit oddly? Okay, good. And so while we have this very basic piece so far, let's talk about how we actually run this. So if we look at the package.json, it automatically has builds here for serving and building. And so this is if we were going to build it on its own. And serve is going to serve it up to be exposed in another library. And I started to get into the demo way too quick. I'm going to actually exit this. And we're going to repeat just a tiny bit of things because I want to show you Vite because it's important for you to know how that works. So Vite is created by using npm init, and then you're going to say Vite at latest. Vite is another way to build and deploy and develop your applications that doesn't use the CLI. It's a completely sort of separate piece. So let's give it our name, fun with Vite. And here you notice that Vite actually works with a bunch of different libraries. It does not have to be specific, but I'm mostly talking about it with Vue, and I'm going to use TypeScript again. Does not work with Vue 2, is tied to Vue 3, so that is something to be aware of. As soon as that installs, I'll open it up in code. Because what I didn't show, let me do this real quick. Is when I wanted to run, let's say serve, this is the CLI, is you went through this process of building the whole app, and successively it would do incremental builds. I obviously made a mistake, but it would do incremental builds, but it was this constant build cycle. And the difference here with Vite is really interesting. So let's open this up. And the way Vite applications are run is to actually just say Vite. And the reason this is different is it doesn't compile your application. That's a big switch for me. What actually happens is here in the index, they're using a feature that's upcoming in browsers but isn't available everywhere called script modules. So what that does is effectively load up your main.ts in this case, compile it, show it in the browser, and then as it hits other parts of your import statements, it then brings those in. And so it gives you this very quick run and change cycle, faster than the CLI. So we go dev, almost instantaneous. Same sort of experience, it comes up very quickly. And the idea is that when you go into production, you're going to do a build, an optimized build, but this is going to allow it to grab in different files separately. And it also makes debugging easier because you're not digging into the Webpack symbols, you're actually debugging the actual files. And so it's incredibly fast and useful. So let's keep that running. And let's do what we did before. We have this hello world component, and I will get rid of most of what they have there, and we'll continue going down the road we had, but we'll leave it at hello world. And I love all of this incredibly awful boilerplate. Hoping V generator will eventually just allow us to do -B as well, because so let's get rid of that, and let's get rid of setup, which we will talk about later. And we'll go back to define. And here we'll have a setup. And again, if you were in the talk earlier, you probably already know this, but this is where the composition API works in Vue 3. It also works in Vue 2, but it does imply some things in how you're going to be developing that are interesting. The options API still works here, but I tend not to use it. Get over all this bloated style. And so here you notice we have an object in here that we're trying to bind to called message. So let's go ahead and create that message, const message equals, and if I just say hello world, I can then return it as the surface area of what I want to bind to, what I want to be visible in the template. So I'll just say message here. And I could have done this without creating, and I could have created it inline as well, but you'll see in a minute why that's important. So if we go back here, hello world shows up, right? Let's go ahead and create a button after this. Actually, let's create an input. The model, which is a way to do two-way binding, I'll put message in there as well. And then when I change it, it should change, right? But of course it's not. It's not having any effect on it. Because by default, anything you're binding to isn't reactive. And what I mean by reactive is it isn't supporting two-way binding, where when the object changes, the UI changes. So we opt into that, though you'll find that you're going to opt into it almost all the time by wrapping it with something called a ref. Ref is a way to define that something has a reference to it, and that means that when we change it, let me bring in the import. When we change it, it will be able to notify, in our case, the template, that change has happened. So here, as we change it, we can see that it's changing all in real time. And this is separate from the Vue instance. The reactivity in some ways is similar to reactive extensions and some others, where it's just a nature of the way the objects are created. And so reactivity isn't tied to this instance of our Vue object. We could have it in a whole nother class, a whole nother section, and still get that same reactivity. And that's probably not what we want it to look like. In that same way, if we wanted to have a function here that says show message, we can do that, and let's go ahead and just bind that to show message. So we're exposing a function, not just data, to our code here. And then what are we going to do? We're going to create a button, click to say when someone clicks the button, what do we want to do? We want to show message. So we're talking about one-way, two-way, and event binding effectively all in the same place. We're not having these separate sort of tiers for each of these kinds of bindings we're interested in. And so if we come here and we say click me, it's going to show you object, object. Wait, what happened? a couple things to note here that are important, because what the composition API is doing for us here is it's trying to rely on JavaScript as much as possible. But this ref object here means that we need to get at the value, actually call .value. You'll actually see that IntelliSense tried to do this for me. Because the message itself is the container for letting other people know. So you can watch on this ref object so that when it changes, you can write code to do things and other things like that. But that means that when we are going to work with it, we need to get the value of that message. And so you'll notice that the message object is a const. That's saying that the wrapper around is immutable. We're not going to change it, but the underlying value can change. It's just that wrapper that doesn't change. And that's why if we had tried to do something like message equals foo here, when we click the button, we're going to get that error because the JavaScriptness, or the TypeScript in this case, is going to say, well, you said it was constant. You can't reassign that because you said it was a constant value. And that's the hint to me that, oh yeah, this needs to be .value because the value isn't a constant. Make sense? Probably need to get rid of those. There we go. And so let's see how we're doing on time. Yeah, we're good. And there's a lot more to the way the kind of component stuff works, but let me talk about how easily TypeScript works with this as well. So let's leave all that alone, and I'm just going to create a quick unordered list, and I'm going to create a list item, and I'm just going to use a v4, which allows us to do to bind over a collection. And I'm going to see v4 books, b in book. So I'm going to have a member called books in the middle that will be something that's enumerable. And then all I'm going to do is say b.title. And so what are we going to do here for the books, right? We're going to say books, but in this case, we're going to say it's going to be a reactive array. Reactive is for non-primitive types. So not numbers, dates, or strings. Reactive is actually a proxy object, so we don't have to really deal with it differently. We just have to include it so that when we want to add items to it, if we wanted to say books.push, come on, Shawn, that would be perfectly valid, right? Because the push is a method on the collection, and so that proxy object is going to know that that change happened and therefore be able to tell anybody that it's changed. We're not going to actually do that. We're going to do something more interesting, hopefully. You'll be the judge of that. Is we want to use a library, and I'm going to go back to the browser for a minute. Open library, if I could type it right. Of course, it's not going to remember it. Nope. Subjects. There we go. That'll do. In theory. So this is a well-formatted JSON file, right? This is just an API that we're going to use in here. Let's say const URL equals, just to have it in there. And then we want to get it. And I'm going to use Axios to get it. So let's just create a new npm install Axios. Could use fetch as well. There's actually a feature that Axios works a little better with TypeScript, and that's why I'm going through the trouble of actually adding it here. And what I want to do is I want to, when this component loads, I want to go ahead and make that call. So I'm going to call a member called onMounted. And onMounted is a method that is on the view as well to say, when this component has been mounted, when it's right before it gets displayed, I want you to do some work. And in our case, I'm going to use Axios to get the URL. right? And this returns a promise, but me being who I am, I want to use everything async and await I can. So I'll say response, await. And so this asynchronous operation we can write in a more synchronous way. Let me bring in Axios. And then we can just say books.splice, and I'm going to replace the entire collection, so books.length, and then response.data.works. Now, how do I know any of that, right? We're getting a warning because we don't know what that is. Like, it doesn't know what to do with it. And we're getting the warning specifically because we're using TypeScript. TypeScript is saying this needs to make more sense. You need to hint at what this is. So let's go back to our browser. I'm going to copy this whole result, and I'm going to do something fun. I'm going to create a new file, and I'll call it models open library.ts. And in Vue, I'm using an extension, and there's also the same extension available for Visual Studio and some other IDEs to say convert the JSON into TypeScript interfaces. I don't know whether you can see that at the top. If that isn't sexy, I don't know what is. So I'm going to change this root object to be the open result, and I'm actually going to change the name of this to book, because it could be more than one thing. But just changing the name doesn't change the interface. So then we can do this in a more interesting way, and we can come back to our call here, and Axios lets us say, I'm expecting an open result. And let's bring that namespace in. Come on. Code completion isn't your friend there. Oh, it's not there. It's there. And import it. And then what does response think it is? Thinks that data and works is a collection of books. But that also means that we need to tell this so it can all be typed. Oh, we need to bring in book as well, I think. And it all works because now we have explicit types. This won't allow us to assign a collection of books into Splice because Splice is now all type safe. That to me is a huge win when you're building complexity into your applications of knowing what you're doing. Does it take a little extra work? It does to sort of understand the types, but when it's that easy to create these interfaces, it lowers the bar on quite a lot. And you can make these shared. They don't have to be inserted in every project. And if I've done this right, what it doesn't like there? Oh, I forgot to return it in books. What doesn't like about show message? That's weird. Oops, that's not what I wanted. So let's go back over. I haven't started a recompile or anything. I'm just using the same ViteApp. And if I've done it right, which clearly I haven't done, show this is not defined. I must have an extra something here. What don't you like about show message? It's always easy once you know how, right? We load it up, it loads up our list, we get it here, Bob's your uncle or whatever you want, but then it makes the binding here even easier. So instead of book and title, let's do ahref, nope, image source equals b dot cover, oh. It's a computed cover. I'm not going to show you the cover. I always forget that I have to call a different API to get the covers, but not a perfect API, but a perfect framework, right? And we're going to all agree on that. And so let's take what we have here and talk about some of the other features. One of the things in View 2 that was really important were filters. And filters in View 1 were pretty expansive. They were filtering a lot. Oh, let me step back. A filter is a way to format data. So you might have a filter in here globally and allow you to do things like title uppercase, right? That would be the notion of a filter in View 2, where you can pass it this thing that it knows how to take the input of title and do something with it, format it for dates or uppercase or whatever the case may be. In View 3, they're gone, and that's freaked some people out. And the reason they're gone entirely, in View 2, they were sort of made a much smaller surface area. In the View 3, they kind of realized that all filters were functions. And so that's what we have now. So let's talk about that for a minute and talk about sort of the use case of how you would do it. So I could certainly do this, uppercase, value. I'm going to tell it it's a string, and that it's going to return a string. It can, TypeScript can infer some of these things. Oh, I know why it's complaining, because I haven't actually returned anything. So val to uppercase. Again, not a really good use of filter, but I think you'll see what I'm sort of going for. And then including it here, and that's a bit annoying. And instead of having a filter semantic that you can then add globally and having more of this surface area, the decision was, by making them functions, we have more flexibility. And so let's create our own function filter library. So I'm going to take our magic uppercase here. And I'm just going to create an object that has one or more of these. I'm going to get rid of the word uppercase there. Right? Nothing special here. It could be doing something more elaborate. But this then allows me to, instead of inserting it there, I'm just going to say import filters from filters. Why doesn't it like where I put filters? Say again? Oh, yeah. And I still think it's one. Yeah, it's one library up. And there's still not a great global way, but there are ways you could sort of, with the use syntax, make them globally. But then I can just do filters, right? And I can either decide to import a couple of them, or in this case, all of them would be available to my entire view object. Again, using JavaScript or TypeScript instead of relying on some extra plumbing that they're writing. This becomes more explicit what's happening to me, and stylistically that can be good or bad. But this is sort of the idea of why filters went away, is because instead of title colon uppercase, it's just uppercase title. And that means how you pass in parameters and all of that aren't magical. They're just code. So if you needed to say, what encoding or what unescaping you're going to do, all of that sort of thing are just parameters to a function. It becomes simple instead of this sort of arcane way of defining them. So let's talk about teleport. Has anyone used teleport? Okay, I didn't think so. Teleport's one of my it's in some ways it's a solution looking for a problem, to be honest with you. But I think you'll see where this can be useful, especially when you're creating applications that live within the context of other applications. So the idea behind teleport is pretty simple. So in this is the index.html that we're creating our object on. And in this case, this is taking up the entire page. But let's make a change there. Let's go ahead and say that we have a div up here, or let's call it a header up here, and I have an h1 that says hello. And then I have, might have a menu with an unordered list or whatever. But let's go ahead and say that I'm just going to have a menu up here. But I'm not going to be responsible for the menu. My View app is. So what we can do then is say, oh, you know what? Here's my template. Let's say teleport to menu. Come on, Shawn. And back here, let's go ahead and make our header. I'm going to use style tags because I'm so lazy today. But background color, Alice blue. We all use Alice blue in all our color palettes, right? So we have our Alice blue here. And notice that it's teleporting part of our UI into that other part of the page. That's what teleport does, is it allows you to go, I'm responsible. This still works. So where did I put the end of the teleport? Let's just put that message up here, right? I still have the text here, but of course when this changes, it's still view component, right? But I'm no longer having to think about having to take over the whole page if there's some benefit. Like maybe 3 of my pages of my application are just server-generated or static-generated HTML, but then I have this one other page and I want to be able to display my menu on that page instead of that. This is a great use for teleport to go, okay, I'm just going to put my menu items up there instead of theirs. And it gives me the ability of being able to interact with the page a little better without having to create multiple components that talk with events amongst each other. It becomes this really simple ability of just going, oh, you know, that one's mine too. Does that make sense? And the last, I want to make sure I'm getting all these. How are we doing on time? Oh yeah, we're good. And I talked about Vite. I should not have typed that fast. I apologize about that. Any questions about anything we've talked about so far? I always think these are going to take, the typing is going to take much longer. Question?
What if 2 things teleport to the same place?
Last in wins. So effectively what it's doing is it's taking those elements that have code and events associated with it, and they're manipulating the DOM to shove them there. So it's eliminating what was in there before. And so interestingly, if there is a menu in that section already, and I teleport into it, what was the raw HTML is removed as well, because they're essentially doing an inner HTML replacement. So, I mean, it's not a, usually I'm doing teleports at sort of the top level app level of these applications. Sometimes if I need to take control of a footer or the button or the picture of the person that's logged in or something like that, I might do it a couple of different ways. But this is one of those things that is more of an edge case, but when you need it, it's crucial. Like being able to do this, I've often seen corporations go, well, let's just make the whole site. To solve this, let's go ahead and make the whole site view. Like even though 3/4 of our pages are just content, let's do this because it's the only way we can get this to work. Or create a separate view component that just does the menu, right? And it's trying to avoid those edge cases that should be simple and make them simple. Other questions?
Could you review again that plugin you used to convert your JSON into your platform?
Yeah, the plugin, so the question was, can I just review it? I just want to make sure you can see the actual plugin is called, which one is it? Oh. What you shouldn't do is have too many plugins in code. Code is really good about when you change machines of bringing all the plugins with you. So about every 3 months I go, oh my God, how do I have all of this stuff in here? Let's try JSON.
I saw one called JSON.
Yeah, JSON to TS. And it's the same name as the plugin for Visual Studio as well. And they both do essentially the same thing. In Visual Studio, it's a right click and it'll be added to your menu option. And here it'll be a command that's inside the command palette. It's not actually oh, I added a keyboard shortcut because I thought I would use it here instead of the command palette, but I didn't. There's also oddly named JSON to ts.com, I believe. Does the same thing. Paste in and it'll produce them for you. So they're all essentially written by the same people and wrapped in different ways. There's an API to this, and so that's just how they're doing it. Other questions? I don't bite. Well, mostly I don't bite. Always afraid that one of my ex-coworkers are here and they're like, don't trust him.
Does the teleport stuff have to be wrapped inside the Vue application, or can that work just as a component?
Say that one more time.
Do you need an actual Vue application rendered in order to use the teleports on different parts of the page?
Yeah, it's specific to Vue. I don't know that there's an API to allow you to just use it in Vue. It's really tied to the template, because if the idea behind teleport is that you could do this by just writing get element by ID and setting inner HTML. This is doing it in the markup specifically so that you don't have to think about it as a separate thing. There are ways of doing this with the Shadow DOM without having to do it, but I don't think that's the way they've implemented it. At least I've never dug into that, if that makes sense. The idea of being able to teleport is a facility of Vue, but also a facility of React, though they have a different name because they didn't want to use the same name and get in trouble for stealing a really good idea. I can't remember what it's called. It's like transport, that's what it's called, transport.
Yeah, just to clarify, but where you're teleporting to does not have to be Vue then?
Yeah, more specifically, it's just markup. If it were in Vue, you wouldn't need teleport. Teleport is specifically to go to something outside the Vue. When I created that element, it was just in the plain HTML that happened to be on that page. And that could be rendered by a server, that could be rendered as a static app, that could be rendered by a CMS. It doesn't care. It just is looking for a selector. And if it's a class selector, it'll only do it to the first one, hopefully for obvious reasons. So most people use IDs. But if you have a selector that resolves to one element, like ID underscore less than image, that would work as well. But the resulting has to be a container. So it has to be a div or a UL or LI or whatever it is. It won't work on solitary objects. Other questions? Well, I'll be up here for a couple of minutes. Thanks for coming. Hopefully I've convinced you at least a little to look at Vue 3, even though you probably can't move to it because you're using Vuetify. But I appreciate your time and continue enjoying the conference.